Have you ever had a moment where time itself seems to freeze? A single second that stretches into an eternity, forcing you to confront a ghost you thought was long buried. For Dr. Claire Anderson, that moment arrived under the blindingly white lights of a trauma bay. The man on the gurney was just another emergency, another life hanging by a thread. But as she leaned in to assess the damage, her eyes locked onto a faded, jagged scar on his wrist. It wasn't just any scar. It was a map of the worst night of her life, a mark she had carved with her own teeth 18 years ago. This is not just a story of a doctor and her patient. It's a story of a past that refuses to die, and a choice that will redefine a woman's entire existence. Prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of a long-held secret. 18 years earlier, Claire was not a doctor. She was just a girl from a small, suffocating town in rural Ohio, dreaming of the day she could escape to the big city. Her parents, Mark and Susan, were devoutly religious and ruled their home with a quiet, unyielding strictness. Their love was conditional, tied to appearances and the judgment of their neighbours. What would people at church think? That question was the soundtrack of Claire's childhood. Her only true sanctuary was her grandmother, Alara. Alara was different. She saw the world in shades of light and energy, and she spoke of intuition as if it were a second language. She was the one who encouraged Claire's ambition to become a doctor, telling her, "Your hands are meant for mending, child, not just what's broken in the body, but what's broken in the soul." This foundation, a life of rigid rules versus a world of unseen possibilities, was the battlefield on which Claire's future would be fought. The party was a blur of cheap beer and loud music, a typical off-campus Friday night in Columbus. Claire felt a thrill of rebellion just by being there. Her ride, a friend of a friend, had vanished, leaving her stranded as a cold November rain began to fall. Her phone was dead. Panic started to prickle at the edges of her confidence. That's when his SUV pulled up. He called himself Shane. He had an easy smile and kind eyes that seemed to promise safety. He said he was heading back towards her dorm anyway. Relief washed over her, so potent and complete that it silenced the quiet whisper of warning from deep within her soul, the whisper that sounded a lot like her grandmother Ilara. She got in, the heated leather seats, a welcome comfort from the biting wind. The small talk was effortless as they drove through the glistening, rain-slicked streets of the city. The turn he made wasn't right. Claire knew the route back to campus, and this was not it. He'd swerved down a dark, industrial side street, the city lights vanishing behind a wall of derelict warehouses. The easy smile was gone from his face, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Just a shortcut," he murmured, his voice losing its friendly warmth. The car slowed to a stop, the engine's purr the only sound in the oppressive silence. "We're not going to my dorm, are we?" Claire asked, her voice a fragile thread. He turned to her, and the kind eyes were now hollow, reflecting the darkness outside. The lock clicked shut with a sound like a jail cell door. In that moment, Claire understood the profound difference between being lost and being trapped. The world shrank to the confines of that expensive SUV, smelling of new leather and old terror. A primal scream built in her throat, but his hand clamped over her mouth before it could escape. The struggle was a frantic, desperate chaos. Her nails scraped against the window, searching for a purchase that wasn't there. He was stronger, his weight pinning her down. In a surge of pure, animalistic defiance, she twisted her head and bit down on his wrist, hard. She tasted blood, coppery and hot. His roar of pain was followed by a blinding flash as his fist connected with her jaw. The world dissolved into a dizzying swirl of stars and agony. As he tore at her clothes, his voice was a venomous whisper in her ear. "Don't worry, I'll be gentle." But his actions were violence itself. He spoke of a small, heart-shaped birthmark above her hip, a detail so intimate that his observation of it felt like a second violation, branding the moment into her memory forever. He pushed her out of the SUV onto the wet, gritty asphalt. Her thin jacket was ripped, her body trembling with shock and cold. The red taillights of his vehicle disappeared into the rain, leaving her in an abyss of darkness and silence. Each raindrop felt like a tiny needle against her bruised skin. She didn't know how long she lay there, a crumpled heap on the side of a forgotten road. Eventually, the instinct for survival, battered but not broken, forced her to her feet. She walked. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to move. The walk back to campus felt like a journey across a barren planet. When she finally stumbled into her dorm, her roommate's horrified gasp was the first human sound she'd heard that felt real. But the trauma had already begun to build a wall of ice around her heart, a silent, frozen fortress where no one could get in. Calling her parents was the hardest thing she'd ever done. The drive home to that quiet Ohio town was thick with an unspoken tension. When the story finally spilled out of her in a torrent of sobs, the first word from her mother wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "How? How could you be so careless? How could you put yourself in that situation?" Her father paced the living room, his face a mask of grim disappointment. "We raised you better, Claire, to be smart, to be modest." Their shame was a heavy blanket suffocating her, making her feel like the guilty party. They were more concerned with the whispers that would ripple through their church community than with the gaping wound in their daughter's soul. The idea of going to the police was dismissed almost immediately. It would bring disgrace upon the family. It would be her word against his. It would ruin her. Only Alara held her. Her grandmother's arms were a refuge from the storm of judgment. She sat with Claire in the quiet of her room, brewing calming herbal tea that smelled of lavender and chamomile. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply held Claire's trembling hands and let her cry. "The world can be a cruel place, my bird," Alara whispered, her voice like the rustling of old leaves. "But you are forged from a stronger fire than you know. Remember that." Later, as Claire prepared to return to a world that now felt hostile and unsafe, Alara gave her a small, smooth riverstone. "Justice has a long memory," she said, her eyes dark with a strange intensity. "And so does blood. Never forget that." The words made no sense to Claire then, but she clutched the stone as if it were a lifeline. Her boyfriend, Ethan, tried to be supportive. He brought her flowers and sat with her in awkward silence, but something had irrevocably broken between them. He couldn't look her in the eye without flinching, as if her trauma was a contagious disease he was afraid of catching. He saw her as fragile, damaged goods. The breakup was quiet and inevitable, another loss in a season of unending loss. Claire threw herself into her pre-med studies with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. The cold logic of biology and chemistry was a balm to her chaotic emotions. She would build a fortress of knowledge around herself, a place where she was in control, where she could fix what was broken. It was a desperate attempt to stitch her own life back together, one textbook and one exam at a time. She was determined to become the healer she so desperately needed herself. The morning sickness started 2 months later. At first, she dismissed it as stress, but when the smell of coffee in the dining hall sent her running for the bathroom, a cold, terrifying dread began to crystallize in her gut. The pregnancy test was a cheap plastic stick from the campus pharmacy. She watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the second pink line appeared. It was faint, but it was undeniably there. A life, created from an act of pure violence. The floor of the dorm bathroom felt like it was tilting beneath her. She sat on the cold tile, the plastic stick clutched in her hand, and a single silent tear traced a path down her cheek. This secret was heavier than the first. This was a secret that was alive, a secret that was growing inside her, a constant physical reminder of the night she wanted only to forget. The phone call home was a descent into a new level of hell. Her mother's silence on the other end of the line was more damning than any scream. When Susan finally spoke, her voice was glacial. "You will come home and we will take care of this. There are clinics." The words, "take care of this," echoed in Claire's head, clinical and cold. It wasn't a choice. It was an order, an ultimatum. Her father got on the line, his voice shaking with a rage he could barely contain. "You will not bring this shame into our house. You will not ruin your life and ours. You have two options, Claire. Fix your mistake, or you are no longer our daughter. The cruelty of it stole her breath. They weren't trying to help her. They were trying to erase the evidence of her trauma, to maintain the pristine facade of their perfect family at any cost. In her darkest hour, she called Ilara. Her grandmother listened patiently to the whole story, her breathing calm and steady. When Claire finished, her voice choked with tears, Ilara said something strange. A child is never a mistake, Claire. Sometimes a soul chooses a very difficult path to enter this world. You will not regret keeping this baby. I feel it in my bones. The certainty in her grandmother's voice was a tiny anchor in Claire's swirling sea of fear and confusion. It was the first time anyone had spoken of the baby as a soul, as a choice, as something other than a problem to be disposed of. It was a flicker of light in an overwhelming darkness. In that moment, Claire made her decision. She would not erase this life. She would choose the baby, and in doing so, she chose to become an exile, severed from the only family she had ever known. Chicago was vast, anonymous, and unforgiving. With the little money she had saved, Claire found a tiny room for rent in a sprawling, dilapidated house in a working-class neighbourhood. The landlady was Brenda, a retired nurse with a voice like gravel and a gaze that missed nothing. She was tough, pragmatic, and didn't ask questions Claire didn't want to answer. Brenda's son Ryan also lived in the house. He was a quiet man in his late 20s, haunted by the ghost of a failed construction business and a mountain of debt. He rarely spoke, communicating mostly through weary sighs and the sad, soulful eyes of a man who had lost his way. The house was filled with a quiet melancholy, a place where three lonely people orbited each other, each nursing their own private wounds in a fragile, unspoken truce. The birth of her daughter was the moment Claire was truly reborn. She named her Hope. Holding that tiny, perfect baby in her arms, Claire felt a surge of love so fierce and protective, it was like a physical force. This was not a reminder of her trauma. This was the redemption. This was the reason to fight. Life became a grueling routine. She worked nights as a waitress in a 24-hour diner, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and grease. Days were spent in class, her mind sharp and focused, fueled by caffeine and a desperate need to succeed. Brenda, seeing the fire in Claire's eyes, became an unlikely ally, watching Hope while Claire was at school or work. A silent bond formed between the two women, a makeshift family forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The relationship with Ryan grew slowly, nurtured in the quiet spaces of their shared home. It wasn't a romance of passion and fire, but one of gentle companionship. He would fix her broken lamp. She would leave a plate of dinner for him when he came home late from a construction gig. They were two people who understood what it meant to be broken. Brenda, ever the pragmatist, saw a solution for them both. "You're good for each other," she'd say. "Two halves of a whole." Their marriage was a practical decision, a union of two lonely souls seeking stability in a chaotic world. He was a kind and decent man, and he loved Hope as if she were his own. Claire knew she didn't love him with the all-consuming passion of novels, but she felt a deep gratitude and a quiet affection that she mistook for a lifetime commitment. Years melted into a decade, then more. Dr. Claire Anderson became a name spoken with respect in the halls of Chicago General Hospital. She was a trauma surgeon, a master of controlled chaos, her hands steady and sure amidst the most horrific injuries. Her life was a carefully constructed fortress, a successful career, a stable if unexciting marriage to Ryan, and a brilliant, vibrant teenage daughter in Hope. The girl from Ohio was gone, buried under layers of scar tissue, ambition, and resolve. She rarely spoke to her parents. Their calls were stilted, obligatory affairs on holidays and birthdays. Ilara had passed away years ago, leaving Claire her journals filled with cryptic notes about energies and auras. Claire kept them in a box, a relic of a past she preferred not to examine too closely. She was a woman of science now, of tangible facts and empirical evidence. And then he was on her table. The chaos of the ER faded into a dull roar in her ears. It was him, older, his face hardened by time, but unmistakably the same man. Shane. A long, nasty knife wound gaped from his abdomen. He was unconscious, his life bleeding out onto the sterile white sheets. Her team was a flurry of motion around her, shouting vitals, prepping for surgery. But Claire was frozen, trapped in a bubble of silent, horrifying recognition. The scar on his wrist, a faint silvery line against his skin, was screaming at her. This was the monster from her nightmares, delivered to her by fate, his life literally in her hands. The scalpel felt unnaturally heavy. For a split second, a dark, venomous thought slithered through her mind. Let him die. One slip of the hand. One moment of hesitation. Justice. But then she looked at her hands. The hands, Alara said, were meant for mending. The hands that had held her newborn daughter. The hands that had sworn an oath to do no harm. She couldn't. It wasn't who she was. She had not spent 18 years clawing her way out of the darkness just to become a monster herself. Let's go, she said, her voice a low, steady command that betrayed none of the hurricane raging inside her. Prep him for an exploratory laparotomy, now! The surgery was a grueling 4-hour ordeal. She worked with a chilling, detached precision, her movements fluid and economical. She was a machine, a healer. She stitched and clamped and repaired, her mind a blank slate, refusing to think about the man, only the injury. When it was over, she had done it. She had saved the life of the man who had tried to end hers. Later, sitting in her darkened office, the adrenaline finally receded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. A wave of nausea and dizziness washed over her. She closed her eyes, and the world tilted violently. Suddenly, she wasn't in her office anymore. She was on a sun-drenched street, seeing through someone else's eyes. She saw Hope laughing, her skateboard clattering on the pavement. She saw a blue sedan, speeding, running a stop sign, the screech of tires, a scream. The vision was so real, so visceral. It left her gasping for breath. The image was branded onto the inside of her eyelids. It was more than a daydream, more than a fear. It felt like a memory of the future. Ilara's words echoed in her mind. Justice has a long memory, and so does blood. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. She called Brenda, her voice tight with a panic she couldn't explain. "Where is Hope?" she demanded. "She just left to go skateboarding with her friends," Brenda answered, confused by Claire's tone. "Stop her!" Claire yelled, the words tumbling out. "Brenda, listen to me. Do not let her go to the corner of Oak and Miller. Keep her home. I don't care how you do it, just keep her home." There was a stunned silence on the other end. Then Brenda, who had learned to trust Claire's instincts over the years, simply said, "Okay, I'll get her." An hour later, a news alert popped up on her phone. A hit and run at the corner of Oak and Miller. A blue sedan had struck a cyclist before fleeing the scene. The cyclist was in critical condition. Claire stared at the screen, a cold dread, mixing with a strange, terrifying clarity. The gift. It was real. The next day, a man was waiting for her outside the ICU. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that seemed out of place in the sterile hospital environment. He looked like Shane, but where Shane was rough-hewn and coarse, this man was polished and refined. "Dr. Anderson?" he asked, his voice calm and deep. "I'm Ben, Shane's brother. I just wanted to thank you. You saved his life." Claire stiffened, her professional mask slamming into place. "I was just doing my job," she said, her tone clipped and cold. She tried to walk past him, but he gently stepped into her path. "Please," he said, his eyes filled with a genuine sincerity that was deeply unsettling. "My family owes you a debt we can never repay. If there is anything at all, I need you to get out of my way," she said, pushing past him without another glance. But Ben was persistent. The next day, a simple bouquet of wildflowers arrived at the surgeon's lounge. The card read, "Just to say thank you again. Ben." No roses, no grand gestures, just a small, thoughtful offering. It made her angry. How dare he try to insert himself into her life? a clean, respectable emissary from the family that had produced her monster. She threw the flowers in the trash. Yet, he was there again the next day, not with flowers, but with a simple offer of coffee. "I sense there is more to this," he said, his gaze direct and searching. "Your reaction to me, to my brother's name, it's more than professional detachment. Did he do something? Before the accident?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Claire felt the walls of her fortress begin to crack. She met his gaze, and for the first time, allowed a sliver of her 18 years of cold fury to show. "Your brother is not a good person, Mr. Calloway, and I don't associate with his family." She turned and walked away, but her words had landed like a stone. Ben watched her go, a deep frown creasing his brow. He was a man who dealt in facts and figures, but he also trusted his gut, and his gut told him that his brother's knife wound was not the beginning of this story. He went to Shane's hospital room. His brother was awake, groggy from painkillers, but lucid. Ben sat by the bed, his expression unreadable. "Tell me about Dr. Anderson," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "What did you do to her?" Shane's initial denial crumbled under Ben's relentless, quiet pressure, and the ugly, unvarnished truth of a rainy night, 18 years ago, finally came spilling out. Ben found her as she was leaving the hospital that evening. He didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, his face pale, his expression gutted. "He told me," he said, his voice raw, with a shame that was not his own. "He told me everything, Claire. There are no words. Sorry is an insult. What he did is monstrous, unforgivable." He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't asking for forgiveness for his brother. He was simply bearing witness to her pain, acknowledging the truth of it without flinching. "Our family is not your problem, but I want you to know he will face consequences for this, and for everything else. I'm done protecting him. I'm done enabling him. It ends now." In that moment, Claire saw him clearly for the first time. He was not his brother. He was a good man trapped in a toxic family, trying to do the right thing. That conversation was the beginning. They started talking. Tentative coffees in the hospital cafeteria became long walks in the park. He never pushed, never pried. He simply listened. He learned about her struggles, her ambition, her fierce love for hope. She, in turn, learned about his own life, the weight of being the good son in a family rotten with secrets and denial. He was the first person since Alara who seemed to see all of her, the brilliant doctor, the tired single mother, and the wounded girl she still carried inside. The quiet, functional marriage she had with Ryan began to feel like a cage. Ryan was a good man, but he had never known her, not the real her. He had married the survivor, not the warrior. The divorce was amicable. Ryan, in his own quiet way, had known for years that they were more like co-parents and roommates than husband and wife. He wished her well, a sad resignation in his eyes. "You deserve to be happy, Claire, really happy." It was a release, a gentle unmooring from a life that had been a safe harbour but never a home. With Ben, she felt seen. He didn't shy away from her scars, both visible and invisible. He cherished her strength, but he also made it safe for her to be vulnerable. He fell in love with Hope instantly, treating her with a warmth and respect that was both paternal and friendly. For the first time since she was a girl dreaming of escape in Ohio, Claire felt the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by her past. One evening, they were sitting on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Hope was inside doing her homework. A comfortable silence settled between them. Ben took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. He didn't have to say the words. She could feel his love for her, solid and real and unwavering. It was a love born not in spite of her history, but with a full, unvarnished understanding of it. A deep sense of peace settled in Claire's soul. The ghosts were still there. They always would be, but they no longer had power over her. They were simply part of her story, not the whole of it. The gift of sight Alara had passed down had not yet returned, but she knew it was there, a quiet power waiting within. Ben turned to her, a serious but gentle look in his eyes. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Claire. You and Hope. I want to build a real home, a place of joy and safety, with you." His proposal wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, a declaration of his commitment. Claire looked at this man who had walked into her life from the ashes of her worst nightmare and had shown her what true strength and honour looked like. She thought of her daughter, Hope, the beautiful, brilliant girl who was the living embodiment of her own resilience. She had protected her daughter from the truth of her origins for her entire life, building a wall around that secret. But with Ben, she finally felt safe enough to tear it down. She knew with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones that he was her future. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Yes," she whispered. It was the easiest word she had ever said. He leaned in and kissed her. A kiss that was not about passion or desperation, but about homecoming. It was a promise of a future built on truth and acceptance. As he held her, Claire knew there was one last secret to share, the final piece of the story that would bind them together forever. She had to tell him about Hope, not just that she existed, but who she was, the daughter of a survivor, the niece of the man he was now casting out of his life. It was a terrifying prospect, the final test of his love and their shared future. The past was a powerful force, but for the first time, Claire truly believed that the future could be even stronger. He eventually put Shane in a long-term treatment facility, not as a brother covering for him, but as a man enforcing a consequence. He made it clear that their relationship was over until Shane took full, unequivocal responsibility for his actions, something Ben wasn't sure he was capable of. This act of definitive justice was, for Claire, a closing of a circle that had been open for nearly 2 decades. It freed her. The weight of the secret about Hope's paternity was the last chain holding her to that dark past. She knew that telling Ben would be difficult, that it would bring a new layer of complexity to their lives, but she also knew that their love, forged in the most unlikely and difficult of circumstances, was strong enough to withstand it. It was a love built not on a flawless fantasy, but on the acceptance of a messy, painful, and ultimately beautiful reality. A year later, Claire and Ben stood on a windswept bluff overlooking Lake Michigan. They were getting married. It was a small ceremony, with only Brenda and a teenage Hope as witnesses. Hope, who now knew the whole truth, stood beside her mother, her hand held tightly in hers. She had accepted the story with a maturity that humbled Claire, her love for her mother deepening with the understanding of all she had overcome. As Claire looked at Ben, waiting for her, she felt Elara's presence as surely as the wind on her face. Her grandmother's premonitions hadn't been a curse, they had been a roadmap, a promise that even from the deepest wound, something new and strong could grow. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a healer, a mother, and a woman who was finally completely free. As she took Ben's hands, she thought about the strange, terrible path that had led her to this moment. Fate, or whatever you want to call it, had brought her abuser back into her life, not for revenge, but for a reckoning. By choosing to save him, by choosing her oath and her humanity over her hatred, she had unlocked the final doors to her own future. She had discovered her own hidden power, and in the process, found a man who was strong enough to love every part of her, especially the broken ones. Her past was not erased, but it had been integrated. It was a part of the intricate, complex tapestry of her life, a dark thread that made the bright ones shine with even greater brilliance. She was ready for her future, a future she would write on her own terms, with love as her guide. In the end, Claire's story wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. By saving the man who almost broke her, she saved herself. The ultimate plot twist wasn't the return of her attacker, it was the awakening of her own inherited power, the gift of premonition from her grandmother that had laid dormant for years. This power allowed her to save her own daughter, proving that the deepest traumas can sometimes unlock our greatest strengths. She chose compassion over hatred, and in doing so, she rewrote her own destiny. She found a love that was not built on a fragile ideal, but on the hard-won ground of truth and acceptance. She proved that the scars of the past don't have to define our future. Were you moved by Claire's incredible journey of resilience? If so, please hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the most powerful moment in her story?